The Queen Anne Street Foundling Hospital boardroom. First Thursday of September, 1826, 4 in the afternoon. And Lady Kalia Renford has not looked up from the quarterly accounts in 11 minutes. Because she does not need to look up. Because she knows precisely where he is sitting. Because she has known since Tolmasha read the fourth name on the roll. And her pen continued moving across the page without pause, without a single tremor. As steadily as if the Duke of Herringwood were a stranger to her, and not the man who had stood across her family's dining table 10 years ago, and changed the course of everything she had ever believed about her own life. The boardroom smells of beeswax and old paper and the particular damp that comes off the Thames in September. And the girls in the upper dormitory are having their supper. And outside this room, the hospital runs exactly as it has run for 7 years. Orderly, purposeful, and entirely her own. Kalia sets down the accounts and picks up the linen supplier's invoice, and does not look up, and does not look up, and does not look up. Across the long mahogany table, in the chair at the far end, the Duke of Herringwood is also looking at papers he did not bring. Mr. Evander Tolmacha, board secretary, 51 years old, and possessed of the particular discretion that comes from having watched two families wound each other across a decade of correspondence, called the meeting to order and proceeded through the agenda with the brisk efficiency that Kalia had employed him to provide. Quarterly accounts. The hospital's income from the parochial trust stood at £11,200 for the year ending June. A new linen supplier from Bermondsey had submitted a tender. Tolmasha read the figures. Kalia approved the trial order. The Duke made no comment. 3 girls had reached the age for apprenticeship, a kitchen placement in Holborn, a laundry position in Islington, and 1 girl, Bess Ferris, 15 years old, placed with a Soho milliner at Kalia's personal recommendation. Tolmacho recorded each placement. The Duke did not speak unless directly addressed, and he was not directly addressed. 90 minutes. The clock on the mantelpiece marked them in quarter-hour intervals, and the room proceeded in its business. And neither Kalia nor the Duke of Herringwood acknowledged by word or gesture or the slightest shift in posture that they had not been in the same room since March of 1816, or that the last time they had faced each other across a table there had been candles and a decanter of Burgundy and a sentence that had ended everything. At the close of the meeting, Theron, for that was his name, the name she had spoken freely once, the name she had not spoken aloud in 10 years, rose and addressed himself to Tolmacha. He said he would be grateful for the minutes of the last 3 meetings if Lady Renford was willing to authorize the release. Tolmacha looked to Kalia. Kalia signed the authorization without reading it and slid it across the table to Tolmacha. Tolmacha carried it to the far end of the table. Theron received the pages from Tolmacha's hand. Their fingers did not meet. The paper was the first thing of hers he had held in 10 years, and it was a signed administrative form. And the room was already emptying around them, and they left by separate doors. The story requires going back. Not far, only to March of 1816, to a dining room in the Renford townhouse in Grosvenor Square, where the candles were burning low and the Burgundy had been poured twice, and Kalia was 27 years old and had been engaged to Theron Herringwood for 4 years, and had spent the 6 weeks prior watching him watch her younger sister Seraphia across every room they shared, and had made a decision the night before the dinner not to plead with him, not to bargain, not to lower herself to the work of holding a man who was already somewhere else. He said it across the table, not cruelly. That was the thing she had turned over for years afterward. The thing she could not simplify into cruelty because it was not cruelty. He said he was in love with Seraphia. He said it the way a man says something he has been holding for 6 weeks and has finally concluded he must say, because he believes himself to be honest, because he has been raised to trust his own judgment, because the 6 weeks of sleeplessness and distraction he had experienced since Seraphia returned from Naples had felt to him like revelation, and the 4 years of steady, devoted care he had given Kalia had felt, in retrospect, like the comfortable habit of a man who had not yet been surprised. He was wrong. He would understand that he was wrong, but not for years, and not in time. Kalia looked at him across the table. She said, "Of course." 2 words, in the tone one uses to confirm something one has already understood. And then she excused herself, and the scene closes there, before she reached the door. Because what happened on the other side of the door belongs to her alone. Theron married Seraphia in the summer of 1816. Kalia attended no part of it. She went to Bath, to her aunt's house in the Royal Crescent, and she stayed there through the winter and into the spring. And she did not write to Seraphia, and Seraphia did not write to her. And the silence between them was the first of its kind in their lives, because they had been, before that dinner, close in the way sisters are close when one of them has not yet understood what the other is capable of taking. In August of 1818, a letter arrived. Kalia was in her aunt's sitting room when it came, and she recognized Seraphia's hand on the direction, and she sat with it unopened for a full minute before she broke the seal. Seraphia was 5 months pregnant and frightened. The letter was not long. It asked for a visit, a voice, anything. Kalia's presence, Kalia's company. Kalia, who had always known what to do when things were going badly. Seraphia wrote that she was sorry. She wrote it plainly, without elaboration, and then returned to the fear, which was the louder thing. Kalia read it twice. She folded it, carried it to the grate, and burned it. She watched the paper catch and blacken and curl and become nothing, and then she sat down and wrote no reply. And the morning continued, and the afternoon and the weeks that followed were ordinary. Seraphia died in February of 1819 in childbed, leaving an infant son named Augustus. Kalia learned of it by way of the Morning Post, which she read at the breakfast table in Bath and set aside without finishing her tea. 6 months after the funeral, she returned to London. She had been left her aunt's house in Queen Anne Street, a narrow, well-proportioned townhouse with a good garden, and she had been left by her father's estate, an independent income. She had also been left by herself, the particular knowledge of a woman who has done a thing she cannot undo, and must decide what to build on the ground where it happened. The Queen Anne Street Foundling Hospital for Girls opened in the autumn of 1819. On a Crown endowment Kalia had petitioned for through 3 months of correspondence with the Board of Guardians, backed by the Renford name and her own refusal to be told no. By 1826, the hospital administered 47 girls between the ages of 3 and 15, an £11,000 charitable trust, a dispensary, a kitchen, 2 dormitories, a schoolroom, and a staff of 7. Kalia ran it from the 2nd floor of the Queen Anne Street house, which connected to the hospital building through a door she had had cut in the party wall. In July of 1826, Parliament confirmed, by private act, that the 2 principal heirs to the Renford-Herringwood Parochial Trust, the joint endowment their fathers had established in 1814, and which 12 years of trustee deaths and resignations had left without proper administration, were the current Duke of Herringwood and Lady Kalia Renford, appointed co-trustees by law. Refusal required surrender of the endowment to the Crown. Neither refused. The endowment funded, among other things, the hospital's operating budget. The September meeting was, accordingly, mandatory. October came, and then November, and Theron attended his second and third board meetings with the same quiet punctuality he had brought to the first. He was, Kalia observed, a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he was offered, and no more. He countersigned the correspondence she put before him without delay. He asked no personal questions. He addressed everything through Tollmache. And Kalia addressed everything through Tollmache. And the hospital's business was conducted with a precision that Tollmache privately considered remarkable and did not remark upon. What Tollmache did remark upon, on a Friday evening in late October, was Theron's fourth, carefully phrased question about the administrative burden Lady Renford was carrying relative to the trust's scope. Tollmache had dispatched the board business in 10 minutes, sitting across from Theron in the study at Herringwood House in Mayfair. And then he had accepted a glass of brandy and listened to 3 questions about drainage repairs and 1 question about whether the hospital's staffing was adequate for its caseload. And he had understood, clearly and without any particular surprise, what the questions were actually about. "Your Grace," Tollmache said, setting his glass down on the edge of Theron's desk, "Lady Renford does not need your money." Theron looked at him. "She does not need your intervention in the staffing," Tollmache continued. "She does not need to be rescued from the administrative load, which she has managed without assistance for 7 years. She runs 47 girls and £11,000, and she does it well. And she has declined 3 proposals of marriage in the past 6 years, which I mention only to establish that she is not waiting to be relieved of her situation. She is in her situation by choice." Tollmache paused. "The question before you is not whether she needs help. The question is whether you have anything to offer that is not help." The study was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned low. "That is a frank thing to say," Theron said. "You asked me 4 questions about her workload," Tollmache replied. "I am saving us both the 5th. After Tollmache left, Theron sat in the study for a long time with the brandy he had not finished. He was a deliberate man. He had always been deliberate, and the deliberateness had served him well in everything except the one decision that had mattered most, which had not been deliberate at all, but had felt, at the time, like clarity. He sat with Tollmache's question and turned it over with the care he gave to things he did not want to get wrong a second time. When he wrote his next letter to the hospital, it was about drainage repairs on the East Wing. Nothing more. November's board meeting brought a change so gradual it could only be measured in retrospect. The correspondence between Kalia and Theron, which had been routed through Tollmache since September, began to be addressed directly, not by design. It simply happened. The way things happen when 2 careful people stop performing the distance between them and begin working in good faith. The letters were entirely professional. They were also longer, by 1 sentence per exchange, and the sentences were specific and considered, and Kalia read each one twice before filing it, which she did not do with Tollmache's letters. At the November meeting, Theron brought Augustus. The boy was 7 years old and had his father's quietness and his mother's dark eyes, and he waited in the entrance hall while the board conducted its business above. Tollmache, passing through at the meeting's midpoint, introduced Augustus to Bess Ferris, who was home for the week from her Soho milliners, 15 years old, quick-handed, with ink on her cuff and an opinion about everything. They spoke for 10 minutes about the stables at Herringwood Hall, which Augustus knew in detail, and Bess received with the serious interest of someone who has never seen a stable but is not going to admit it. Kalia, passing through the entrance hall at the meeting's close with a folder of correspondence under her arm, paused in the doorway. The boy was explaining the difference between a hunter and a hack with the gravity of someone conveying important information. Bess was nodding and asking a question Kalia could not hear. She stood there for perhaps 15 seconds before continuing to the boardroom, and she did not examine what she felt, because it was not the time. At the December meeting, Theron presented a proposal, an additional £200 drawn from unallocated trust interest, to be applied to the hospital's linen budget, which the Bermondsey supplier's figures had revealed was running thin. He had worked the numbers himself. He presented them without preamble, and the proposal was sound, and Kalia approved it without amendment. And for the first time since September, they were working in the same direction without one of them managing the other. "It's a good supplier," Kalia said after the vote. "The figures suggested it," Theron replied. It was the longest exchange they had conducted directly in 10 years. 12th night, 1827. The hospital held its annual holiday gathering for the girls, with mince pies and a country dance in the schoolroom, and this year, a guest, a friend of one of the hospital's donors, a cheerful man with a red waistcoat, who kissed both his children on the cheek before sitting down, and who was, though no one yet knew it, carrying scarlet fever. Within 3 days, 3 of the youngest girls were feverish and spotted. Kalia's matron quarantined the dormitory and sent for the physician. Kalia canceled the January board meeting by note and set herself to managing what needed managing, which was considerable. Augustus Herringwood fell ill the same night at Herringwood House in Mayfair, fever spiking before midnight. The boy confused and frightened and calling for his father, who was already at his bedside and who understood within an hour that his own physician was no Kalia Renford and that Queen Anne Street was 20 minutes away, and the child needed better than what he had. He arrived at the hospital's door at 1:30 in the morning. Kalia opened it herself. She had not been to bed. She took one look at the boy in Theron's arms, said, "Bring him upstairs," and led the way without another word. What followed was 4 nights in the same 3 rooms, and those 4 nights did more to dissolve 10 years of managed silence than any conversation either of them could have designed. Augustus occupied the smaller sick room. 2 of the youngest girls, Nan, 4, and little Polly, 6, occupied the larger. Kalia and Theron took watches in rotation, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, though the off hours were rarely sleep and more often cold tea and a chair in the corridor outside, whichever room needed watching. They changed linens. They carried broth in the dark and held it steady while small hands shook. They cooled foreheads with damp cloths and spoke in the low voices that sickness requires, voices stripped of their daytime formality by exhaustion and the particular democracy of a child's fever, which does not care about social architecture. On the second night, Kalia carried a basin of cooling water down the corridor to Theron, who was sitting at Augustus's bedside with his coat off and his cuffs rolled back, the way a man sits when he has given up performing competence and is simply enduring. She had not slept in 30 hours. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking, not from cold, from the particular trembling that comes when the body has been managing on will alone and has begun to run out. Theron saw the basin and rose to take it. His hands closed over hers, briefly to steady the water. And they were there for 3 seconds, his hands over hers, the basin between them, and she did not pull back. He set the basin on the nightstand. He returned to the bedside without speaking. She stood for a moment in the dark room, looking at the sleeping child, and then went back down the corridor. By the fourth dawn, all 4 children were past the worst of it. Cooler, sleeping properly, the spotted rash beginning to fade. Kalia stood at the sink in the dispensary, rinsing out linen with the mechanical thoroughness of someone who has done it 30 times in 4 days and has stopped thinking about it. Her shoulders moved once, a single involuntary contraction. Not weeping, she was not weeping. It was simply that the body, when it has been held rigid for 4 days, sometimes releases in the wrong direction. Theron had come in for the morning's first basin. He stopped when he saw her shoulders. He crossed to where she stood. He placed his hand on her shoulder blade, through the wool of her working dress, not against her skin, one hand, briefly. And he said her name. Just that. Kalia. And then he stepped back. She rinsed the linen. She did not turn around. After a moment, she said, without turning, "Thank you, Theron." It was the first time she'd used his Christian name in a decade. 6 weeks later, Lord Sefton resigned from the hospital's board. He did it by letter to the Morning Chronicle, which was worse than a private resignation in every conceivable way. And the letter was brief and specific. He could not in good conscience continue as trustee of an institution whose founding patroness was now administering a crown endowment jointly with, as he phrased it, her former affianced. A circumstance he described as inconsistent with the morally unblemished administration the hospital's girls deserved. Kalia received her copy at breakfast. Theron received his at Haringwood House. They met at the hospital that afternoon, the first time they had met outside a scheduled board meeting since September, and sat across her desk in the second-floor office with the letter between them. "He intends the phrase as an attack," Theron said, looking at the clipping. "He intends it," Kalia said. "The public will read it as a statement of the established record." She looked at the phrase again, morally unblemished administration, which is, on the whole, what the record has been. "On the whole," Theron said, and did not press the qualification. They drafted the joint reply together, their first genuine piece of collaborative writing, and it showed because Theron's sentences were plain and factual, and Kalia's were measured and precise, and together they produced something that was both, which was better than either alone. The reply noted that the co-trusteeship had been established by Act of Parliament, that the hospital's accounts were audited annually by the Crown, and that the board's governance had been conducted without impropriety. It was signed by both names. After Theron left, Kalia sat alone with the draft for an hour. She read Sefton's phrase again and again, and she understood something she had not let herself understand before, that she had been administering a moral record she had not fully earned, and that the world's version of her was cleaner than the true one, and that if Theron was preparing to ask something of her, and she understood now that he was, in his deliberate and unhurried way, preparing, she could not permit him to ask it while he did not know what she knew about Seraphia's letter. She wrote him a note that evening. She asked him to come to the dispensary on Thursday. Thursday evening, late February 1827. The children's ward was quiet. The dispensary smelled of carbolic and dried lavender, and the lamp on the workbench threw a steady light across the rows of glass bottles and the folded linen on the shelf. Theron arrived at 7. Kalia was already at the workbench, standing, her hands at her sides. He came prepared. She could see it in the particular stillness he carried. The stillness of a man who has rehearsed something, not because he is performing it, but because he knows it is important and does not want to stumble. He began to speak. That he had been wrong in 1816, wrong about Seraphia, wrong about what he had mistaken for revelation and what he understood now, to have been 6 weeks of infatuation he had not been experienced enough to identify. That the marriage had taught him this quickly and completely. That Seraphia had deserved better than a man who had chosen her for the wrong reason. And that Kalia had deserved better than the conversation across the dinner table. And that he had understood both of these things for several years, and had not said them because he had not been in a room with her, because he was not certain saying them served anyone but himself. "Theron," Kalia said. He stopped. "I have a thing to say first," she said. "If you still wish to speak when I've finished, you may." He settled into the chair opposite the workbench and waited. She remained standing. She did not pace. She did not move her hands. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. And she told him about the letter. She told him it had arrived in August of 1818, that it was from Seraphia, that Seraphia was 5 months pregnant and frightened, and had asked Kalia to come, a visit, a voice, any form of presence. She told him she had read the letter twice in her aunt's sitting room in Bath, on a Thursday morning in August, with the windows open and the street noise coming up from the Royal Crescent below. She told him she had carried it to the grate and burned it. She told him she had written no reply and sent nothing and heard nothing further until the Morning Post in February of the following year. She told him the hospital existed because of that letter. 47 girls, £11,000, 8 years of work, built on the ground where a plea had been received and not answered. She did not weep. She did not apologize. She stated it in the same voice she used for quarterly accounts, because it was the only voice she had left for it. Then she said, "If you wish to reconsider what you came to say, I will not hold you to anything." The dispensary was very quiet. From somewhere above, one of the older girls laughed at something, a brief sound, and then the building settled back into its evening silence. Theron was still for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he rose from the chair. He crossed to where she stood at the workbench, and he did not embrace her. He took both her hands, turned them palm up, and folded his own hands around them, closed over her palms, his fingers wrapping the backs of her hands, holding them together between his own. He held them for 1 minute, without speaking. Then he said, "I came here expecting to deliver a confession. I find instead that we are confessing together." He paused. "This is the first honest conversation either of us has had in a decade." Kalia looked down at their joined hands. She nodded. He released her. He did not embrace her. He picked up his hat from the dispensary chair and left before 9 o'clock, and the sound of the street door closing was the only punctuation the evening offered. After the dispensary, Kalia stopped writing to him about anything that was not hospital business. She did not explain this. She simply did it, and he did not ask for explanation. And the fortnight that followed was the quietest in the hospital's recent history. The children recovered, the correspondence ran on schedule, and Kalia sat each evening in the second-floor sitting room with the quarter's accounts and the particular knowledge that Theron now carried what she had carried for 8 years, and that the weight of it distributed between 2 people was not lighter exactly, but was differently shaped. When she wrote to him again with a personal line, it was at the bottom of a letter about the East Wing drainage. She wrote simply, "Come to Thursday's meeting." He came. They worked through March and into April, and the working correspondence lengthened again, 1 sentence, then 2, then a postscript. And Augustus began spending Saturdays at Queen Anne Street, where he could usually be found in the entrance hall with Bess Ferris on her half-days, discussing the relative merits of various London stables with the air of 2 people who have discovered a shared language and are making the most of it. In April, the Dowager Countess Renford wrote from her house in Portman Square. The letter was one sentence. "My dear, is the rumor true?" Kalia answered in one sentence. "There is no rumor, Mama. There is a friendship." The dowager did not reply, which was itself a form of reply. In June, at the close of the Thursday meeting, after Tolmache had gathered his papers and the other board members had gone, Theron remained in his chair at the far end of the table. Kalia remained at hers. The room was quiet, the afternoon light coming through the tall windows in long horizontal bars. And Theron said, without preamble, "May I ask, in a year's time?" Kalia looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "to the asking, not the answer." "I accept those terms," Theron said. He rose, collected his papers, and left. In the corridor outside, Tolmache, who had not, in fact, gone as far as the staircase, continued walking without pausing. November 1827, the annual hospital benefit concert at the Hanover Square Rooms. The program was Handel and Haydn, performed by a small orchestra engaged for the occasion, and the proceeds went to the hospital's winter fuel fund. And every year the same crowd attended, donors, trustees, a scattering of well-wishers from the parish. And every year Tolmache's seating plan contained one small administrative notation that he had never explained, and no one had ever asked him to explain. A seat in the third pew. Reserved, kept empty. For 8 years, that seat had been empty. Tonight, it was not. Augustus Herringwood sat in it, in his best coat, slightly too large for him, and recently let out at the cuffs. And beside him sat Bess Ferris. 16 now, a year into her millinery apprenticeship, wearing a hat she had made herself that was both professional and slightly too fashionable for a charity concert, and that she wore with the satisfaction of someone who has earned every stitch. They had arrived together, chaperoned by Tolmache, who had delivered them to their seats and then stationed himself at the end of the pew, with the expression of a man who was not watching anything in particular. Kalia entered the hall on Theron's arm. The room registered it, a small collective adjustment, the way a room adjusts when something it has been expecting finally occurs. No one remarked. The concert proceeded. The Handel was excellent. The Haydn was better. Bess leaned over twice to whisper something to Augustus, who listened with his father's serious attention and then smiled in his mother's way. And Kalia, seated 3 rows back, watched this without expression. Afterward, in the vestibule, the crowd thinned slowly around them. Donors retrieving cloaks, the orchestra packing instruments, the particular noise of a pleasant evening concluding. Augustus and Bess went to fetch their things from the cloakroom. Tolmache found someone to speak to at the far end of the vestibule and found him very interesting. Kalia turned to Theron. She had decided something, and he could see it in the way she turned. Not impulsively, but with the deliberateness of a woman who has sat with a decision long enough to be certain of it. She went up slightly on her toes. She placed both her gloved hands flat on his chest, the palms resting against the wool of his coat, and she looked up at him. He bent toward her. The kiss was closed-mouthed and lasted 4 counts, and her hands stayed where they were for 1 breath after it ended before she withdrew them, unhurried. Across the vestibule, the Dowager Countess Renford, who had not been invited, who had come anyway, who was 81 years old and dressed in her widow's black and moved through a crowded room with the authority of someone who has never needed to explain herself to anyone, crossed the marble floor and stopped beside her daughter. She placed her hand briefly on Kalia's sleeve. She said that the soprano had been very fine, particularly in the second movement, and that she hoped the fuel fund had done well. Then she moved on, toward the door, without looking back. Kalia did not weep, but she stood in the vestibule with the crowd moving around her, and the November air coming in cold through the open door. And she did not weep, because she was not sad. And because the Dowager Countess Renford expressing approval through a sentence about a soprano was, in the language of the Renford family, an unambiguous declaration. Theron offered his arm again. She took it. They walked out into the November street together, and the door of the Hanover Square rooms closed behind them, and the evening was cold and clear and entirely ordinary. Late that night, alone in the small second-floor sitting room at Queen Anne Street, Theron had returned to Mayfair with Augustus an hour ago. The hospital below was quiet, the girls long since asleep. Kalia sat at her desk with the quarter's accounts and a single lamp, and the particular silence of a house that is full of people who are all, at this moment, sleeping. She set down her pen. She looked at the empty chair opposite her desk for 10 seconds. The chair where Theron had not sat tonight, where no one had sat tonight, where she sometimes put her coat when she came in late and sometimes left a stack of correspondence she meant to address in the morning. 10 seconds. She picked the pen up again. The night was ordinary. The East Wing drainage had been resolved in October. The linen budget was holding. Bess Ferris had made a hat that was slightly too fashionable for a charity concert, and had worn it with complete confidence. And Augustus Herringwood had sat in the third pew in his too large coat, and the empty seat was no longer empty, and the wedding was somewhere next spring. A year from the asking, as agreed, which placed it in June, which was a good month for it. Tonight she was alone in her own house, and the lamp was burning, and the accounts wanted finishing. She finished them. She sealed the folder and set it on the corner of the desk for Tollmacher in the morning. She blew out the lamp. The title sentence had been answered. Not by retraction, not by apology, not by the undoing of anything that had been done. It had been answered in a dispensary on a Thursday evening in February, when two people had told the truth to each other and found that the truth, distributed between them, was something they could both stand inside. He had been wrong about her in 1816. She had been silent about Seraphia in 1818. Both things were true, and both things were in the past, and a child had sat in the empty seat, and her mother had touched her sleeve, and she had placed her hands flat on his chest and looked up. And none of it had required the undoing of what had come before. Only the naming of it, finally, to the one person who needed to know. She went to bed. The house was quiet. Somewhere in the spring, there would be a wedding.